If you've ever looked at Memphis, Tennessee's highway layout, then you've noticed that I-40 loops around the city rather than going through it. Now, there's nothing abnormal about that in itself. There are plenty of places where highways are routed around the city. However, the interesting part of this layout is that the highway carrying I-40 seemingly continues as a freeway through this interchange. It penetrates deep into the city of Memphis, but stops just short of reaching downtown at the opposite interchange where I-40 and I-240 intersect once again. Now, on the surface, there's nothing unusual about a highway being routed around the city, but why does this freeway segment exist and get so close, yet not quite reach downtown Memphis? Well, it turns out, guys, that this freeway stub actually was officially slated as I-40, and it originally was intended to pierce through the city along this pathway. However, the unbuilt portion of the route was canceled, and a landmark event that would trigger various freeway revolts in cities around the country and mark the end of unopposed use of eminent domain for building highways and other transportation infrastructure. On this video, we're going to take a look at the origin of I-40 in Memphis and exactly what transpired leading to the cancellation of the original plan, and how we got here today. Back in the day when I was but a young lad learning about America's great highways and railways, this situation with I-40 in Memphis was the first that I had read about the freeway revolts. Then upon a recent trip to Memphis and seeing and driving Sam Cooper Boulevard for the first time, it inspired this video. Hit the like button as we get started and go ahead and subscribe if you enjoy this type of content, and let's take a trip to Memphis, Tennessee. As we can see from the 1955 interstate plan for Memphis on the map here, things look pretty simple. It actually looks quite familiar to today with the notable exception of the east-west freeway across the city. The beltway in this photo was planned to be the I-240 beltway around the city, while I-40 would travel directly through the city and continue into Arkansas via the Hernando de Soto Bridge. While I-55 was the north-south route through the city, the I-240 loop was envisioned as a route to direct traffic around Memphis that wasn't destined for the city in order to improve overall traffic flow. During the early days of the Eisenhower interstate highway system, speed was the name of the game. Not just speed on the highways themselves, but the speed at which the federal government wanted the roadways to be constructed. As such, all routings of the proposed interstates in the Memphis area were quickly approved by state and local officials. The plans were not without local opposition. Like other cities with property owners in the proposed path of these new interstates, there were protests in Memphis. However, these protests were typically overruled and unable to prevent most interstate construction in the face of eminent domain. While the federal government did require public hearings and meetings with local residents when determining the routes of these highways, in the case of I-40 in Memphis, officials were very vague when explaining exactly what businesses and structures would be affected. It was basically understood that the federal and state governments had the final say on where a route would go, and many began to assume that I-40 through Overton Park was an already decided and done deal. Memphis city leaders also wanted to quickly see the highway constructed, as they viewed it as a vital economic means of which to get wealthy suburban residents to the downtown area and keep their wealth flowing into the city. Regardless of the local opposition, in 1960, the Tennessee Highway Commissioner David Pack had decided that the route through Overton Park was the best route and the interstate would be constructed as such. Back during these times, the governing rule of interstate highway construction to justify building through neighborhoods was that it had to be proven that there were no other economically feasible alternative routes. I-40 was taking a direct route through Memphis and the park. The battle was over, or so it was thought. Construction appeared to be imminent. However, a group who called themselves the Citizens to Preserve Overton Park emerged to reignite the discussion around the highway and challenge the route through the park. Under pressure from local citizens, the city council, which once supported the route through Overton Park in 1968, voted in opposition to it, with Councilman Gwen Assum stating that the expressway through Overton Park not be routed in its present proposed location, but that said proper authorities select another feasible route, with the provision that if no better route can be obtained, the route using the north perimeter of Overton Park or the south part of the North Parkway Boulevard be chosen. Federal transportation officials were furious and demanded Memphis officials make a final decision on whether they wanted an expressway or to lose the federal funding and the highway through the city altogether. It was later revealed that two possible alternatives had been considered against the routing directly through the park. One would take the highway north of the park through the heart of the current Rhodes College, while the other alternative would run south of the park through Midtown. The cost, required geometry, and disruption to the local street pattern led to the rejection of these alternatives and determined the path through the park to be the most feasible. Upon the revelation of these possible alternatives and the fear of losing the expressway funding, The city council finally delivered a vote to federal officials approving the route through Overton Park in April of 1968. After losing at the local level, the citizens to preserve Overton Park went to the state level. They demanded that the highway be depressed as low as possible through the park. State transportation officials agreed, as long as the highway was still going to be built. However, later, they went a step further and demanded that the highway be tunneled underneath the park instead. Even though the state had agreed to a depressed and covered freeway, the U.S. DOT stated that the design could not be altered and that the freeway would not be depressed. Shovels were ready to move by the end of 1969, and at the final hour, the citizens to preserve Overton Park took their case to the federal level. Key language from the Federal Highway Act of 1966 will prove vital in this case. Federal officials must complete all possible planning, including consideration of alternatives, to minimize any harm to any park that was in the path of a proposed expressway, and that the use of parkland was forbidden unless there was no prudent or alternate use of the land. In 1968, the language was modified to call for the use of reason and discretion and not to overrule local preferences when choosing a route. These new modifications were called the Parkland Statutes. At this time, the U.S. Transportation Secretary was John Doupe, and the citizens to preserve Overton Park versus Doupe went to federal court in 1970, where they were handed a defeat and failed to win an appeal to halt the construction. The judge ruled that they could not show that Doupe didn't meet the requirements of the Parkland Statutes. However, the citizens to preserve Overton Park did manage to convince Justice Potter Stewart to issue a stay on the ruling, and a showdown was set for the Supreme Court. In the Supreme Court, it was determined that Secretary Doupe had failed to demonstrate that the path through the park was the only feasible and prudent alternative, and that he himself had not made the determination as required, but instead just went with the decision of the city council. He had not even considered the tunnel option for the expressway and was found in violation of the Parkland Statutes. Doupe was defeated 8-0 at the Supreme Court. Justice Thurgood Marshall stated, "It is a plain and explicit bar to the use of federal funds for construction of highways through park. Only the most unusual situations are exempted." It appeared that Doupe had gone with the route through the park because it was cheaper and already in the land acquisition process rather than considering any of the alternatives. After the defeat, the case went back to district court, where it was then sent back to Doupe for revision. By this time, new environmental laws require full disclosure of the environmental impacts of a proposed project and its alternatives. This led to all of Doupe's proposed revisions being rejected. Eventually, things led back to the tunnel proposal. However, the cost has skyrocketed over $300 million. City leaders agreed to the tunnel, but the Tennessee DOT did not. And later, the federal government began to allow funds originally slated for highways to be used for other transportation projects. In fear of potentially losing the money, city government and business leaders finally gave up on the highway in exchange for $320 million from the federal government. Interstate 40 was then rerouted onto the northern side of the proposed I-40 loop, and the funds were used to build a trolley system and other city streets in Memphis. The controversy was finally over. In Memphis, the portion of the highway that was built was removed from the interstate highway system and turned over to the city of Memphis from the Tennessee state government. The portion of the route from Highland Avenue to the gates of Overton Park was instead constructed as a parkway rather than a freeway in 2001. This route is now known as Sam Cooper Boulevard. Being owned by the city of Memphis rather than the Tennessee DOT, the route is unsigned and not part of the interstate nor U.S. or state highway system. I was able to check out this route firsthand a short while ago, and you can still see the blank overhead signs that appear to have been meant for I-40 Little Rock as a possible control city. Also, to my surprise, the roadway was pretty well maintained. Based on the poor, neglected condition of the canceled I-70 inside Baltimore's Beltway, I expected similar here, but Memphis appears to have done a good job of keeping it up to par. While traffic flow would have been somewhat improved with a direct route, personally, Memphis traffic isn't too bad compared to most other cities, so the I-240 routing works out. Where Memphis probably needs the most updates is a new Mississippi River Bridge crossing. On the national level, the case had major ramifications. Up to this point, most highway construction was approved without much regard for local concerns. Eminent domain was used to quickly snatch up and build through any area where a new highway was proposed to travel. The case set many precedents that had to be followed going forward in regards to parks, the environment, right-of-way acquisition, and the displacement of residents. Transportation officials going forward were required to be far more thorough and transparent when proposing new routes and presenting their alternatives to the general public. And there it is, guys. That is how and why I-40's original route was canceled through Memphis. What are your thoughts on this canceled freeway and canceled freeways in general? Would you like to see more videos on some of America's canceled interstates? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. See you on the next trip coming soon to a town near you.